Hello everyone, and welcome to my Arcane Mage guide. Before we get into the guide, I want to kind of sell you on why Arcane is so fun, because it is actually the least played PvP spec in the game, I do believe, outside of tanks. So in 2s, 3s, RBGs, etc., Arcane I think is the least played, but I think it is a very rewarding specialization if you can pull it off. So it's difficult, but it's very rewarding. It's complicated, but it's not too complicated. It just takes practice. So I'm going to kind of go over, the main strengths and weaknesses of Arcane Mage. I'm going to go over, how you do the basic damage rotation. I thought a lot about how to actually pull off the damage and explain it. It's kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to do my absolute best. Talk about some of the defensive utility that Arcane brings, as well as just my overall thoughts on the specialization. It is, like I said, the least played specialization in PvP, as far as I know. If you go and look at like leaderboards, like, Drusvar, for example, you're going to see that there's not that many people actually playing it, but it is really, really fun. And the main fun thing about Arcane kind of revolves around Arcane Barrage and a couple different buffs you get. So every single time you Arcane Barrage as an Arcane Mage, you do a few things. So first of all, it's a way to deal damage and dump your arcane charges, which we'll explain more later. But it also gives you a stacking buff called Arcane Tempo. So if you can maintain this buff, you get an extra 10% haste the entire game. And you also maintain this buff called Chrono Shift, which is the most fun thing about Arcane Mage and what makes you feel like you're like a little tracer running around the map. So you get a constant move speed increase as an Arcane Mage. You also get run casting with your clear casting procs. So when you do get clear casting procs, you can run cast with your missiles, which means you can play around pillars and LOS. And it's just a really, really overall smooth, enjoyable specialization. So let's get into it without further ado. This is going to be the most complicated part about the guide, okay? And I'm going to try to dumb it down as much as possible. So Arcane Mage, the way you deal damage is it's fairly simple, but it has a lot of complexity behind it. So Arcane Mage is one of the few specializations that actually has to manage mana. So you have to manage your mana, which, if you're a Fire Mage or Frost Mage, you don't have to worry about that at all. You also have these arcane charges, as you can see, and those arcane charges build up when you use specific spells. So when I cast Arcane Blast, the charges get bigger, and when the charges get bigger, two things happen. The spells cost more mana, and the spells do more damage. Not every spell, but most of your spells. So like Arcane Blast, Nether Tempest, Arcane Explosion, and more importantly, Arcane Barrage. The more charges there are, the more your Arcane Barrage cleaves. So if you have multiple charges, for every charge, it'll cleave an extra target. Kind of a bad example here, but that will hit up to like 4 targets with the Barrage, I think 4 targets when you're maxed out on charges. Okay, so the general gameplay of Arcane is you want to be at max charges doing damage, but simultaneously, you also want to be dumping those charges for your barrage so you can maintain your haste stacks and your movement speed and stuff like that, okay? And then you also get clear casting procs. When you get clear casting procs, you get to use arcane missiles. Now, you have a few different ways to get to max charges. One of the worst ways to get to max charges is by just hard casting Arcane Blast. You almost never want to do this where you're just casting Arcane Blast and getting charges. In PvE, maybe that's something you do. In PvE, it's really not. So the way we're going to get to max charges is with our Arcane Orb. Okay, so we can use Arcane Orb. And the way it works is the more targets you hit, the more charges you get. So if you want to bowling ball your Arcane Orb on as many targets as possible, and that's going to put you at max charges, okay? Now, Nether Tempest is a buff we really haven't had to worry about in a long time. And it's going to be a lot of cleave, so if you're polymorphing, you don't really want to use it, but it is going to be very good damage come Tuesday with the changes. So it actually is something I think you're going to want to maintain at 4 charges. So when you get to 4 charges, you can just throw up another Tempest, and then you can just start blasting. So just start blasting. Few things to note is when you get clear casting procs, you want to use it for more than one reason. First of all, it's good damage, but you also want to get this buff, which is called Nether Precision, okay? So when you get a clear casted arcane missiles, it's going to give you this Nether Precision buff, and that Nether Precision buff is going to empower your next 2 arcane blasts. So in general, you want to make sure you have that buff when you're using your Arcane Blast, especially when you're using like your Presence of Mind Blast, because that is one of the cooldowns you have. Presence of Mind, you get Presence of Mind Blast. Okay, so I know there's a lot going on, but the general gameplay is you want to be at max charges, you want to maintain your Nether Tempest, you want to be blasting, and you want to dump your missiles for a clear casting proc so your blasts are even more powerful. And if you can, you want to weave in your barrages, okay? So there's a few special things. That's like the general gameplay. And you could do things too. If you're being like attacked, for example, your instant cast damage is going to be more like, you know, you're using an orb to get charges, you're using some missiles, maybe you cancel them early to fake a kick and use a barrage. And there's a new talent now called Orb Barrage, where you have a 10% chance per target hit with your Arcane Barrage to fire out an orb. So if you're cleaving lots of different targets with your Arcane Barrage, you're going to get these free orb procs, okay? I want to talk about a few things. You have some cooldowns that we haven't talked about just yet. You have Arcane Surge, which is like your main offensive cooldown. You have Mark, or Touch of the Magi, I think it's called. I think I renamed it Mark. Yeah, Touch of the Magi. And obviously you have your Arcane Orbs, and you have Presence of Mind. So Presence of Mind gives you 2 free Arcane Blasts. Arcane Surge is a hard casted ability that when it goes off, it gives you a ton of mana regen. So you regen all your mana. And it also gives you a bunch of spell power. Okay? So you get a bunch of spell power, you get a bunch of mana, and it does a decent damage. In general, you don't really care about the damage. At least I don't. So a lot of the time, oh, you can. Like, it is an ability that hits hard, but I feel like people get baited into thinking that you need to like cast it for damage when you really just want to get the buff up sometimes. So sometimes I'll just cast it on like a pet or like a totem or something like that. You know, like because Arcane worries about being interrupted so much, because you only have one school of magic. You really just want to be getting that buff up when you can. So a good way to do, like when I'm in Soul Shuffle, for example, I'll normally just like mass invis and cast it from stealth. And then that way I have the buff rolling immediately, and I can start pumping out, you know, the damage that I want to do. Okay, so let's go over Touch of the Magi. Touch of the Magi is the main way you're going to reliably get your charges up. So as soon as you press Touch of the Magi, it puts you at 4 charges. Now, if you're spec'd into Arcane Echo, which you should be come Tuesday, so when this guide is relevant to you, and first of all, Nether Tempest gets buffed, you want to spec into Arcane Echo. And how Arcane Echo works is when Touch of the Magi is on the target, a second damage event occurs where every little bit of damage will kind of, it'll echo. It'll echo the Touch of the Magi and do like an AoE pulse. So I'll kind of show you what it looks like here. Let me get a few Arcane Missile procs, okay? So I'm going to get some clear casting procs. I have 1 right now. Okay, I have 2. This is good enough. So what we're going to do, this is like a basic kind of rotation for damage. If I want to put up my Touch of the Magi, you always want to dump your stacks first if you can. So I just dump my stacks, put up Touch of the Magi, and then I can start blasting. Like put Nether Tempest up, and that's going to proc this Touch of the Magi thing. Proc the Touch of the Magi, proc the Touch of the Magi. And I would say, yeah, you obviously want to blast as much as you can. But I'll show you what the damage looks like here. So during that kind of like burst moment, Arcane Echo was actually 24% of my damage. So it's a significant amount. It's going to be really important. It's not something you do a ton of right now, but I'm telling you, with the changes to Nether Tempest, it's going to be a ton of damage that you can add to kind of your burst rotation, okay? So I'm just going to take a moment here to just do my rotation and try to explain it, because I know it could be complicated. So like in general, at the beginning of a game, you can do things like this, okay? So I'll do it pretty quick, but I want to slow it down as well. And I'm not going to be able to give you all the answers. Arcane is like one of those things that you have to kind of mess around with a little bit and practice. But a really like kind of general opener for Arcane is going to be like a mass invis into Touch of the Magi. If you get a missiles proc, you can dump your missiles proc, and then you want to start blasting twice because you have the 2 bonus blast, and then dump your missiles again. Then you can palm blast, and then you dump your missiles again, and you can blast, and then barrage, okay? Near the end of your Touch of the Magi. So, But that's basically the general gameplay. So hopefully that helps. And I should have put Nether Tempest up too. So I even messed up there a little bit. We'll do it again. I'll do it one more time, but I want to explain a few other things. So a few things about your damage you care about is Arcane Harmony. So when you missiles, it gives you a buff, and that buff builds up to a stronger barrage, okay? You also have something called Arcane Bombardment. So Arcane Barrage has an execute effect, where if you use Arcane Barrage and someone's under 35% health, it does additional damage. It says 100%, but it's actually heavily nerfed in PvP, but you can still get like 200,000 Arcane Barrages. So pay attention to that. If someone's under 35% health, can execute them with that. Sorry, I was just looking at the length of this guide. We're going to go through the talents too, but yeah, so Orb Barrage, remember that when you shoot out your orb, when you barrage, it has a chance to shoot out an orb based on target's hit. Your Nether Tempest with Touch of the Magi and Arcane Echo is going to be important. Your Arcane Barrage Execute, that's another one that's important. And then, of course, like I already mentioned, you want to be maintaining this Arcane Tempo stack. And now that my cooldowns are up, I'll show you the opener again, okay? So you can drop a Ring of Fire if you want. Mass Invis. Go for the Arcane Surge. Put up your Touch of the Magi. Put up your Nether Tempest. Start missiling. Start casting Blast. If you get a clear casting, you want to dump it so your next blast is stronger. Missiles, missiles, blast, blast. Missiles, 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 missiles. And then if they ever get an execute range at any point, you can dump your arcane charges. Okay? And it's not the most important thing in the universe to maintain arcane tempo. Like sometimes if you're sitting there and you can actually just blast, 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 blast with clear casting, like you're not always going to want to dump your blast if you don't have good, or you're not always going to want to dump your charges if you can just free cast. If you can, and you can get your charges back really quickly with like your arcane orb, like Touch of the Magi, I'll show you. So if you're just like free casting, you get your missiles, you like get arcane blast, barrage, you get, you got a proc, shoot it out again, get your charges back, start casting again, missiles again. But anyways, that's all I'm going to cover for the damage. Like I said, it's one of those things you kind of have to play around with a little bit. This is definitely good enough for like a basic guide. If you guys have specific questions, you can come to my stream and I can try to help out. But in general, yeah, that's like a pretty standard basic guide for arcane mage damage. I thought a lot about how to explain it. It's a hard thing to explain. You kind of got to mess around with it a little bit. So I'm going to quickly do one thing. So I'm going to go over talents for you guys really fast because I said I would do that. So I'll quickly go over talents and kind of what you can mess around with. I think this is a good way to do it. So you have a few different options. In general, I don't think, since the Arcane rework, I don't think you really want to worry about the mana gem. You can get it, but I would say no. I wouldn't worry about this and this. So I think these are kind of like options you're not really going to pick. This is not a talent you're going to pick. This is not a talent you're going to pick. So what is that? I personally don't like Radiant Spark. There are some people that like Radiant Spark. You can use it, and basically the way you use Radiant Spark, the simplest way to use Radiant Spark is basically pre-cast it before you want to do arcane blasts. There are more complicated ways to use it, like putting it up, doing like a few ticks of missiles to build it up, and then using your palm blasts on it. But it's not something that a lot of mages are playing right now. So for the purposes of this guide, I'm just not going to include it, and I wouldn't worry about it too much. This is like, I guess, you know what I'll do? But instead of putting an X here, it's like an orange question mark. This is not a talent though, you did delete that. So that leaves you with a few different options. You basically have I would say you have like one flex point. There's not that much you can really wiggle with. Most of the talents are pretty mandatory, in my opinion, especially things like Orb Barrage. So Orb Barrage is, in my opinion, mandatory. All of these talents are mandatory. All these talents are mandatory. Like most of the things you're going to be playing around with are absolutely mandatory. The one kind of point you have to play around with is this one. But even this, I think, is going to be mandatory once Nether Tempest becomes meta, which it will very, very shortly. So this one point right here, you can mess around and you put into different things. There are some interesting utility spells like your Supernova. Supernova is a really good spell. You can use its 25-second cooldown. It does zero damage. The only thing it's useful for is an interrupt. So if you're fighting like a Marks Hunter or like a Demo Warlock or Destro Warlock or anything, you can use it as an interrupt because it knocks you up in the air. So it doesn't actually interrupt the spellcast, but it will stop the spellcast by just causing an event that knocks somebody up in the air. Okay, so Supernova is one that you can play around with. Impetus is another one, which gives you a 10% spell damage buff if you are casting Arcane Blast at 4 charges. So basically you have a higher chance to generate, an additional Arcane charge with Arcane Blast, number 1. You don't really care about that, but the thing you do care about is when you're at max stacks, you have a chance to gain a damage buff, which I think is probably the most competitive talent with Arcane Echo. And then you can go for a Prismatic Barrier too, which increases the strength of your Prismatic Barrier, which is one of the strengths of Arcane. And that's really the only options. But I think come Tuesday, Arcane Echo is going to be probably what we end up playing with. The only thing to mention about Arcane Echo is you might not, like if you're playing a comp that relies on CC, that's going to be the first thing that you're going to want to drop, I think anyways, because if you're going for like finesse CC and you have an Arcane Echo up, not only does Arcane Echo pump and do damage to everything, but your Nether Tempest is also going to jump around and AoE everything. So in general, I think if you're playing to win with CC, you're probably not going to want to play with Arcane Echo and maybe go with Impetus instead. And you might not even want to use Nether Tempest as much, but it's going to be a big damage loss. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so talents. That's good. The general tree for Mage is pretty standard. For this video, I'm just going to leave it like this. Okay, this is the general tree. You can do things like, obviously you can get the ice block heal, you can get the shorter cooldown on ice block, you can get spell damage reduction if you want, you can get improved slows, which actually works on your chrono shift. So if you get the improved snares, it makes your chrono shift better. But for the purposes of this video, this is the general tree. You can mix around it if you want. Here's the arcane tree. You can mix around with it if you want. PvP talents for arcane, there's actually a lot of different options. So Master Shepherd's getting buffed. It's going to be a really competitive talent. When you land a sheep, you get bonus move speed and bonus versatility. It's going to be 12% on Tuesday, so you get basically a 12% damage buff. I think it'll be really strong. It also causes your polymorph not to heal. Ring of Fire is really nice. I love Ring of Fire, and mostly love it because it is something you can cast that's not on your arcane tree, which is really important because Arcane Mage actually has to cast a lot, believe it or not. In most situations, you are one of the specializations that has to cast a lot. So Ring of Fire is very good. Mass Invisibility, I think, is a really, really competitive talent if you end up getting Mass Invisibility from the general tree. But then you also have fun spells like Arcanosphere, which is getting a big buff. And Arcanosphere is like one of my favorite spells because it gives you the ability to poke through pillars, which is really strong. So if a team is pillaring you a lot, you can actually channel the Arcanosphere. It has a large range. The longer you channel it, the stronger it is. And you can cleave a bunch of people. So if people are behind a pillar, you can harass them quite a bit with Arcanosphere and Ring of Fire. It's a really fun talent in BGs. It knocks people back, and it's getting a big damage buff. So that's definitely one to look out for. Defensive talents, you have Master of Escape, which lowers the cooldown on your greater invisibility. I think this is a really underrated talent because it gives you the 60% wall every minute and 15 seconds, which is good. You have Temporal Shield, which is also really strong. So an extra defensive button if you want or need that, which I sometimes use against like cleaves and hunters. You have Ice Wall, which is really good for zone denial. If you guys play Mage, you know it's pretty decent. It's not something you pick the most. I would say my general loadout as Arcane is Arcanosphere, improved mass invisibility, Ring of Fire, and then I also like Temporal Shield. So Temporal Shield, Arcanosphere. I don't really know how we're going to fit in Master Shepherd, but we'll figure it out. But yeah, lots of different PvP talents for Arcane that you can situationally use. I'm constantly mixing up my talents, and I recommend you do as well because in terms of PvP talents, I don't think there's like a build that everyone agrees on. I think it's situational, and I think that's one of the fun things about it is you can mess around with a lot of the different talents. One of the cool things about Arcane is Prismatic Barrier. So all the mage specs get their own unique barrier, and mages get a really cool one, or Arcane mages get a really cool one called Prismatic Barrier. While the barrier is active, magical effects are reduced on you. So you actually get CC reduction, which is neat. If you get polymorphed with Prismatic Barrier, you're polymorphed for a shorter duration. If you get feared, it's a shorter duration. If you get dotted, it's a shorter duration. Not only that, but you take less damage. So magic attacks are less effective against you essentially when you have Prismatic Barrier up. So if like a big heavy hitting ability like a Glacial Spike is about to hit you, you can use your Prismatic Barrier and it's going to reduce damage by 15%, making it less effective, which is really, really strong. Okay. You know, there's more I could go over in terms of like, you know, general mage gameplay, you know, like, you know, going for things like Dragon's Breath, Ring of Frost, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this guide's already getting kind of long at 21 minutes. So we're kind of leave this to Arcane specific. We went over the offense, we went over the defense, you know, went over the talents. Like I said, this is a spec I highly recommend that you guys try out. It's really, really fun. If you guys have questions about the damage rotation or anything else, feel free to come to my stream and ask me. I really do encourage it, and I'll do my best to figure out and give you as good of information as possible. So hopefully you got something from this guide. Hopefully you end up trying out the spec. I think it's going to be really strong, especially with the Nether Tempest buffs, the Arcane Missile buffs. It's been the spec that I have the most fun on by far. So it's really, really enjoyable. I recommend you check it out. It can be frustrating, but I promise if you guys you know, practice it, learn how to do your damage, deal with fake casting interrupts, stuff like that, it is more of an advanced spec, but I think anyone can play it with enough practice. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thank you guys very much. Love you. And we'll see you next time. Peace.